I wanted to look at how imperial plant life in particular and land and politics are bound together and have been of interest to artists in Wales and India. And to do this, I wanted to look back and to start with an image that's in the Glynn Vivian collection, which is of Swansea. And if we go to that slide, and this is what I think is a sort of typical enthralling prospect view, and it was made after two brothers called the Buck brothers, and would have been the delight and fancy of elites. And these realistic images of nature continue to be championed by the Victorians. And what I would say is that apart from being sort of driven by the idea that in landscape and nature lay the sublime, it was also sort of visual pat on the back and an exclamation of triumph and imperial prowess. And we see this in particular, sort of, I'm quite familiar with the Daniels brothers, who were sponsored by the East India Company and travelled and made these sort of subscription artworks. But what I'm also interested in, and working with the Glynn Vivian art collection, is what happened when you broke the rules. And as we know, the best artists like to do, veered from convention. So there's a rather exceptional work that's actually in Swansea itself. And it was made by a rather exceptional Welsh artist called Frank Branwyn. And if we go to the next image, I have a sort of photo of him at the later stage of his career in 1932, when he was working on something for the Rockefeller Centre. He was an apprentice for William Morris, and was commissioned by the House of Lords to create a work for the Royal Gallery in the Palace of Westminster, which would, and to quote from the sort of brief, would show the true wealth and beauty of the British Empire. What followed, if we go to the next slide, was a rather more sort of psychedelic, fecund empire than was expected. This is just one of the 18 panels he made, and it's particularly of India. It was an obsessive, painstaking process. He spent a long time studying animals. He sort of coaxed his wife's parrot into posing for him. And then after 7 years working on this commission, they were rejected. The peers and the lords screeched their discontent with these images. They were, and I quote, far too exuberant for our conventional and restrained surroundings. Just imagine, said another lord, 5 feet long bananas with grinning black monkeys looking over them in a room like this with its historic associations. Their insistent motives ill accord with the Waterloo Chamber and would appear inappropriate, added another lord. So these were too rambunctious and maybe too revealing and candid. So by 1933, they'd been acquired by Swansea City Council, and a year later were placed in a hall specifically named after Frank Branwyn. At precisely the same time that this commission was evolving, there were, however, acceptable images of the empire's vegetation, flora and fauna being produced. And as Branwyn toiled, Britain launched and ran something called the Empire Marketing Board. It was an initiative to promote the consumption of colonial spoils. And if we go to the next slide, what we'll see is a poster from this campaign. And if we were in a different scenario, we could zoom in and show that this is sort of mapping all the trade routes and encouraging people to buy, as the poster very starkly says, buy empire goods from home and overseas. There were other campaigns, if we go to the next slide, which were exclaiming, drink empire-grown tea. These are held in the Manchester Art Collection, a part of a wider sort of 5-piece bit of branding. At the time, they were leading graphic designers employed by this marketing board. And with mounting concerns around Britain's economic long-term prospects, everything was done to make these goods appealing and sexy. And if we look at the next slide, it's sort of slightly stretched, the sort of visual appeal was bound up with feminine sex selling. there were even plans for shops which were dedicated to sort of tickling the taste buds and literally getting people to consume the fruits of empire. Um, Although these were unrealized at the time, there are a contemporary artist duo called Cooking Sections who opened their own version of this in London in Baker Street in 2016. And this was actually called the Empire Remains shot. If we go to the next slide, we can see the facade. But fierce commerce was not at its core. Rather, the shop wanted to scrutinize the legacies of empire, the deep marks that it had made on the natural world, by speculating on the possibilities of selling back the remains of the empire. And I want to look at one project that was part of this great sort of program of events, which was called The Forest Does Not Employ Me Anymore. If we go to the next slide, one of the products in this shop was an elegant sort of wooden stool made in Karnataka. And aside from the sort of product and the visuality of it, there's a story. And this was, for the artist, a approach to the East India Company's introduction of an ornamental plant species called Lantara camara to India in the early 19th century. And it began really ornamentally. It entered into Calcutta's botanical gardens. But what happened was it closed its grip on India's native vegetation and has since besieged over 13 million hectares of vegetation and decimated subsistence and cash crops alike. Such is its voracious growth that its destruction has proved futile. So Cooking Sections, in collaboration with the Forager Collective and an indigenous people in the Mahadeshwar Hills, repurposed it, and capitalizing on the plant's tensile strength and the sort of traditional sort of bamboo craft skills of this tribe, they have created these objects. And if we go to the next slide, you'll sort of get more of a sense of it. And it's sort of a GIF which wiggles around. You can see the interior. As one of the members of Cooking Section said, the project tries to test the ways the British Empire shaped the world we live in, and how one can disengage and turn around the logic. So plants were not only brought for aesthetic shaping of India, but they were also used to create borders. And there's a border called colloquially known as the Great Hedge. And if we go to the next slide, we will see this. And in the green, you'll see on this map that it was a salt tax boundary which ran along India from 1840. It was a man called Alan Octavian Hume, who was the Commissioner of Customs for the Northwest Province, but also a botanist who started to deploy plant life to sort of protect imperial revenue. And what he did was like deploy Indian plum and many other sort of species, and in arid places where nothing else would grow, like sort of prickly pear, to reinforce this tax boundary and to create a hedge. At its peak, the hedge was 2,300 miles, 12 feet thick, and guarded by 12,000 men. Now, this is something that contemporary artists are well aware of, this sort of physical markings that are made on the environment by empire. And it's sort of territorial residues like this which interest Rina Kalat. And if we look at the next slide, we'll see, and apologies for the quality of this slide, a 10-diptych work called Leaking Lines, which uses borders as an artistic device. So what we see here is that each drawing, if we go to the next slide, you see a title in it's a two-part work, diptych obviously. Below you see a little title, and that's named after an iconic boundary. And this abstract landmass below is composed of woven cables and severed with a laser cut line. And above we have charcoal landscape sketches showing these lived geographical impacts and markings. What this does is it both like satirizes the apparatus of state, the potency and permeability of borders, but also memorizes the often violent acts which remain felt in countries today. One of these works is of the far left, is of the Mcmahon Line, and that was drawn up in 1914 in a similar convention by a British administrator to divide the Tibetan region of China and the northeast region of India, and it remains a site of contest. And this area was a place that was originally a starting point for Reena Banerjee, another Indian artist who, if we go to the next slide, created this work, A Lost World. And this was installed in Pennsylvania. And what we can see is that she takes sort of Asia's rivers and mountainous landscapes as a starting point to build this stunning floor-based geography. And it's an evocative work. What she's done is she sort of whips up and rearranges symbols from a global store of materials. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see in this detailed shot, we have figures which she's bought on eBay in France and Germany. There were also cowrie shells, which marked out rivers essential to trade. She included coins from various countries. And in the next slide, we'll see piles of sort of plastic cups, which were used to signify water shortages, which are an ongoing concern from climate change. This sort of imagined landscape, as Banerjee has said, was not to sort of be realistic, but was to show the parts of the world that interest her. And it's a kind of, and I quote, a fabrication, invention, and creation of individual identity. And so this sentiment, to go back to Swansea, I would suggest would have rung true with Branwyn. If we go to the next slide, over to the next slide, to have a look at this. I hope, and I urge you, if you're in Swansea, to go and see these. I hope that what this sort of fast, concise talk shows is that landscapes are laden with power struggles, and often what we find at the root of representations of nature are the politics of place. Thank you.